my name is Raimon Llull, and I'm one of the chairs of the Humanities at DIAS. And I'm very happy to introduce one of our new DIAS assistant professors, Rosa M. Porto, who is working at the Center for Medieval Literature here at SDU and at DIAS. When I came to SDU 10 years ago, I was quite disappointed that there was no art historical department or any art history at all at the university. But now we have one. And in those 10 years, I think, in the humanities at least, the image side has also developed immensely, both in teaching and in research in all fields. So I think it's extra timely that we have one art historian now. So Rosa took her PhD in Santiago de Compostela and has been in Cambridge and the Netherlands and at University of York, and now we're very happy to have her here. And her research comes out of studying medieval books, illustrations in medieval books, but she is also engaging with other sides of art history and modern art history and so on, as we will probably hear. So please, Rosa.
Thank you very much, Lars, for this introduction. Today I will be speaking about diagrams, that is, those images where the experience of nature and sometimes of the human creation too are represented according to a geometrical order. And in doing so, I hope that it will allow me to explore some of the epistemological issues posed by images, in the contention that these can create some sort of common ground for a place like this, like DIAS, where both people on the side of the sciences and on the humanities meet. And I was convinced of the suitability of this topic for this talk today by remembering this book, Franco Moretti's Graphs, Maps, and Trees, where he advocated for the use of this sort of abstract means of representation as part of his idea of distant reading in the study of literary creations. And by distant reading, he understands that distance is not an obstacle, but a specific form of knowledge. Fewer elements, hence a sharper sense of their overall interconnection. Shapes, relations, structures, forms, models. And he goes on and he adds, while recent literary theory was turning for inspiration towards French and German metaphysics, I keep thinking that there was actually much more to be learned from the natural and the social sciences. This book is a result of that conviction and also, in its small way, an attempt to open an in-front discussion. So my presentation will be some sort of response to Moretti's arguments, because when I read this book, I thought, well, on the one hand, there is a long tradition in the use of these diagrams in ancient times and in the Middle Ages, and in areas that we can relate to the humanities, what we would call humanities now, or to other areas where the distinction between sciences and humanities was not clear. And on the other hand, I was also puzzled by his suggestion that this kind of abstract way of representation, where supposedly knowledge is put in front of our eyes, can be more neutral than other ways of knowledge, those afforded by figurative images or by text themselves. Because I feel that it's always very difficult to stabilize the meaning of images, and in that contention I cannot but rely on Walter Benjamin and his notion of Denkbilder, so thinking images. He developed after the study of Baroque emblems such as the one on your right. This comes from Cesare Ripa's Iconologia, so the science of images. And what Ripa did was to create some sort of visual language where he merged, on the one hand, concept, an image, a symbol for that concept, and an explanation. And what Benjamin realized is that images and text have their own ways of presenting reality, and that sometimes text and images clash. So in that sense, Benjamin was persuaded that we can use, of course, images as conceptual tools, but sometimes images can think by themselves and lead us to places we didn't expect. So that is some sort of general framework for this talk. And I will be also exploring issues that are not directly related to my research, but I hope that we'll understand why they are at the core of my own interest and concerns. So my research is focused on the analysis of illuminated historical texts in the Middle Ages. So I try to understand how history was imagined in the Middle Ages, how time was conceptualized, and also how history was written. So the three things at the same time. And in analyzing some of these manuscripts, I have very often found this sort of diagram. And that is my starting point. So you can see here, this is a sort of general universal chronicle depicted with this sort of diagrams. So here you have Japheth, Ham, and Sem. So the three sons of Noah and their descendants, and this is placed in this kind of general chronology column. So when I was looking at this image, I began to think where this sort of abstract way of representation comes from. And this is a small detailless kind of example of a diagram that I think that I can use as my sort of red thread behind this presentation. So this kind of representation comes from Roman times, early Roman times, and Pliny gives us an explanation of this way of thinking about the past and ancestry. And he reminds us that in these Republican times, patrician families used to cast wax masks of their dead ancestors and to get them in a sort of cupboards in the courtyard of their houses. And sometimes that these masks were also supplemented by some images of the deceased with a short biography, and that these images were depicted in some walls, and that lines were used to explain the family connections between these members of the family. And that is what was called stemma, or stemmata in plural. And funny enough, this is the same procedure we still use when trying to explain the relations between manuscripts and to explain the history of the transmission of a text in the Middle Ages. So, for instance, here this is an example of the transmission of the work of Lucretius in the Middle Ages. So, up you have the supposed archetype from which all other witnesses descend, and their relations are explained by those lines. The stronger the line, the clearer the relation between these witnesses is, the less, the more conjectural. But the most important thing is that you can see that time is expressed in this kind of descent. So top means earlier, bottom means later. And that was exactly the same way in which those Roman stemmata work. And this same logic is the one that operates in manuscripts like this. This is a genealogy of the kings of France. So you have this kind of written account of the lives and deeds of each kin. And this stemmata, this tree, is also displayed on the page to keep us thinking about this idea of continuity, of temporal continuity. In this case, this sort of graphic visual display is present, but in other cases we don't have any kind of visual supplement, but somehow this idea of the stemma is behind the writing of history. So this is an example of how images and this kind of abstract diagrams conform the way we think about time. So that was why I was so interested in this sort of diagrams. But, and this is the other issue I try to discuss today, that images, as I said, are never neutral, and they can bring other associations. So from this basic Roman the idea of the stemma, other arrangements were devised to think about family relations. And it was Isidore of Seville who developed this alternative arrangement, what it is called the arbor consanguinitatis, because it's not a representation of a given family, but it's a sort of device intended to explain the different degrees of family relation. Because you must think that in the Middle Ages, unless that you were detached more than 7 degrees, you were not allowed to marry. So here, if you are able to read this, you will see the parents and the offspring. And from that, you have the grandparent, grand-grandparent. Here you have the grandchild and all that. And here, the uncles and nieces. So you can see how this works. And this is a different arrangement from the one we had. It keeps on operating from this logic, from top to bottom, but the logic is different.
I have a question to the very first image you showed, because you said it's accounting for time. Did they count years at all, or did they just count number of descendants? Was there any construction of counting years in those? Yeah, in the Middle Ages, or was it all, in the Biblic fashion to count number of ancestors?
No, they were, on the one hand we have chronological tables, so you have parallel, the synchronic development of events throughout time, and sometimes using even different chronologies, depending for Roman Empire, for the Greek Empire, for the from Persian. But on the other hand, you have images as the one I showed, where you have both things at the same time.
Okay.
So you have this sort of genealogical arrangement and also this basic chronology that places this family in time. But here it's something different. This is an abstract device, as I said. And here you can see that this notion of stemma, so sort of vegetal a plant, has been reinforced because of the superficial resemblance of this triangle and this column to the image of a tree. But it doesn't work as a tree, because you know that the tree grows from the roots to the branches. And here we have a different construction that expands from this central point in different directions. By that, what I mean is that this sort of abstract diagrams don't need to be that abstract, and actually, because they have still some sort of figurative associations, they can lead us into different directions, and they can be used in a creative way. And as an example of this, I would like to show you these other trees by the visionary Joachim of Fiore, where he uses this by then common image of a tree for thinking about time and for thinking about some truths of Christian faith in a very original way. So for instance, you have here, this is a history of the people of Israel. So you have, on the one hand, Adam, here you have Jacob, and from Jacob you have the 12 tribes. Then you have here, at the time of Oseas, you have the two main kingdoms where, in which Israel is divided. Then you have Christ, and then at the top, as the last sprout, you have the second coming of Christ. So it's a new way of thinking about time in visual terms, using the idea of a tree as a generating principle. And here it is the same. We have a different tree, a very special tree, because this is not about time. This is about the abstract idea of the Trinity. So here you have Father, here the Son, and then the Holy Ghost. But you can see that here you have the branches are interconnected in order to express that the Trinity is at one hand one and threefold. And this is again other example of a creative use of the notion of tree to think about knowledge. This is the protagonist of our talk, although I will be speaking about him at the end. So Llull also used this image of the tree to explain his idea of knowledge, but again in a very productive way, because he uses the roots to place the main generating principles of his thought, and the branches to represent the main conceptual and cognitive procedures he devised. And that was new, because the sort of trees that were used in philosophy, medieval philosophy at that time, were of this kind, the Porphyrian tree, used to explain the different philosophical, logical categories devised by Aristotle. So you can see that a Porphyrian tree is always based in this idea of branches that subdivide and that lead us in a sort of chart. So it's a different idea. So I'm showing all these trees just to give you an idea of the potential of images as cognitive tools, and how the figurative elements and the associations ingrained in those figurative diagrams can help us to stimulate thought.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I was wondering if you go back to the previous slide, one even further. Yeah. I mean, all the trees until we saw the Trinity, they have been like what we in the computer science or mathematics sense would call trees. Yeah. But here we somehow see branches that come and join again, which we also have names for, directed acyclic graphs. So I'm wondering, are there also illustrations where there are really like cycles involved, or is that then outside of the tree idea?
This is the only tree I can think of where there is a play with this notion of circle and interlace.
Okay.
But I will show other images that are based on circles later on.
Just one is remarkable, this right tree.
Yeah, no. Well, I was hoping that those images were make you think to those in the realm of sciences, because
Thanks.
I'm sure that you will be able to tell me many more things about this. So somehow this sort of Porphyrian tree is at the back of something like this, like Linnaeus chart with all the different species. But even if we can think of this as a very abstract display, it has all these trees as its source. But this taxonomy, which may be what Moretti had in mind when thinking about this kind of diagrams in the realm of sciences, as I said, had a long history. But they also allows us to question whether this sort of systematicity and regularity we can find here in Linnaeus' chart can be applied to the study of human creations. And actually Moretti was also aware of that, so thinking about different kinds of trees and their values, he remembered this idea by Kruger, that you can think of figuratively a tree of life and a tree of knowledge, and their trees organized, their branches organized, are organized in a different way. So Kruger says, the course of organic evolution can be portrayed properly as tree of life, as Darwin has called it, with trunk, limbs, branches, and twigs. The course of development of human culture in history cannot be so described, even metaphorically. There is a constant branching out, but the branches also grow together again, wholly or partially, all the time. Culture diverges, but it syncretizes and anastomoses too. Life really does nothing but diverge. Its occasional convergences are superficial resemblances, not a joining or a reabsorption. A branch on the tree of life may approach another branch. It will not normally coalesce with it. The tree of culture, on the contrary, is a ramification of such coalescences, assimilations, or acculturations. This schematic diagram visualizes the contrast. So we sometimes need to look for different visual arrangement and visual metaphors. And I guess that when thinking about human culture and images themselves, it is much more useful to think in terms of a raison, as theorized by Deleuze and Guattari, because the raison is non-hierarchical. If we think of a tree, we have a hierarchy. It has no center, so it has no trunk as the tree. And it can expand in multiple directions. So this is a sort of complex network. And that is how images work as well, as I will try to explain in the second part of my talk. And we also must think that when working with images, images are powerful and have the capacity to be imprinted in our minds. So thinking in those, according to these two lines, on the one hand that images work as a network, and on the other hand that they remain imprinted in our brain, even in an unconscious way, I cannot but present my second cultural hero, so Avi Warburg, who developed a sort of new method of analyzing human, images and in general, a new way of cultural analysis. He called it iconology. With iconology, what Warburg meant was precisely this kind of web-like nature of images, and how they were able to convey meanings and associations and generate new images whose previous associations and associated meanings could resurface at any time. And because this network of images was so difficult to pin down, he, in the last years of his life, undertook a very ambitious project, which he called Mnemosyne. With this Mnemosyne project, he just tried to convey the idea of a history of images in flux. So he had different blackboards where he was pinning images. But these were not left as such, because he was rearranging these images all the time, because he was finding new connections between them, whatever he just looked at them. But it is interesting that the first of these panels was left untouched. And this is the one he called orientation. And by orientation, he meant three images. On the one hand, an image of the cosmos, an image of the great centers of culture in the West, in Antiquity and the Middle Ages, and also modern times, and a kind of network of some of the greatest patrons of art in the Renaissance, so the Medici. So this is the family and their associates. So with that, we have a sort of map or chart to find our way in the world of images. And I would like to ask you to remind this kind of connection between the cosmos, geography, and personal networks, because it will be evocated later in my talk. So paradoxically, we had to wait until the 20s to understand how images work and how complex they can be. But this was something that the Middle Ages was very aware of. And the work done by Francis Yates and Mary Carruthers have offered a compelling view of of the role accorded to images in medieval thought. As they explain, in Antiquity and in the Middle Ages, memory was conceived of as a visual faculty. So perception was translated into mental images, what was called phantasmata, and these mental images were treasured by memory. But at the same time, memory was the source for imagination. So those mental images were also the repertoire with which imagination, creation worked. And by that, it was used this Latin term, inventio. So the act of creation was conceived of as a finding in this realm of memory, finding in the realm of those images already in our minds, which could be endlessly recombined. So memory was imagined as a space where all these images were gathered. And in this sense, I would like to show you this image. She is Christine de Pizan, one of the most famous female writers of the Middle Ages. And in her poem about the Wheel of Fortune, he starts by placing herself in what she calls the salle de fortune, so the room of fortune, where a lot of images cover the walls with the most memorable deeds of the past. And this is a sort of metaphor for memory. She is recalling those stories from her own memories. And those which were most memorable were the ones that were not only most clearly imprinted in our brains, but those which were able to bring back other images, to stimulate further thought. So memory was thought in Antiquity and Middle Ages as a space. So it was not only a visual memory, but a locational memory. That meant that when trying to develop procedures to encourage the use of memory, memory was imagined as a space where we had the right place for each memory, for each of these phantasmata, so they were easier to recollect. But if memory was conceived as a sort of architecture where we can go in and find something, architecture was also had the possibility of being turned into a virtual space. where we were able to project the images we had in mind. And not by chance, it was the cloister, the space, where many of these kind of virtual spaces were created. And I would like to present here one of the most extraordinary images ever created in the Middle Ages, which was a mnemonic image conceived by Hugh of St. Victor, a monk in the house of St. Victor in Paris, one of the main centers of learning in early 12th century Paris. And at that time, Paris was not that different from the Paris in the 60s and the 70s in the 20th century, in the sense that hundreds of students just came to Paris to listen to one of these greatest intellectual figures, such as Abelard or Hugh himself. And this was a time where there was a huge debate about the use of reason. So, was reason able to explain faith, or was reason a threat for faith? Because figures such as the aforementioned Abelard were using logic to challenge the teachings of the fathers of the church, to question some of their ideas. So in that context, Hugh, who was a more traditional scholar but not less brilliant, conceived of this huge image of what he called the Arca Mystica. What is the Arca Mystica? The Arca Mystica is a mnemonic image used by Hugh to explain everything. So here, so it's a sort of huge building encompassing all sorts of knowledge. So you have here not only an explanation of what Noah's Ark was, but using Noah's Ark as a sort of generative concept, he also explains history of the world, the revelation, vices and virtues, the relation between cosmos, microcosmos and the general cosmos, and all sorts of things. How this work? Well, first of all, I would like to say that images in the Middle Ages were not, as we are told sometimes, just for the illiterate. They were not thought of as a sort of second-class way of knowledge. They were accorded sometimes even a superior role in learning, because, as Hugh says, it is by using this sort of sensory images that we can reach the eternal truth. Because sometimes language is not enough. So what he tried to do with this image is to construct a conceptual building where to accommodate these four interpretations of the Ark of Noah. So according to the four ways in which the Bible was read, we can think of the Ark of Noah as a historical event, historical object. We can try to analyze in detail. It can also be analyzed in a typological way, so as a symbol of the church. It can also be understood in a moral way as a repository of all sorts of virtues. And it can be used in an anagogic way as a prefiguration of the earthly Jerusalem, so the heavenly Jerusalem. And all these readings are generated through this image, where he builds a diagram that can be read as a three-dimensional structure. So it can be traversed longitudinally, but also from top to bottom. And their images are truly imagines agentes, so images that put forward all sorts of readings, nuances, and generate this sort of allegorical, not only allegorical, but also allegorical readings. For instance, here, it is under discussion whether this was an actual image of more or less the size of this wall, which was used for this kind of public lecture, or whether Hugh only devised a sort of diagram which was animated mentally through the use of memory. I would favor the second option, but anyway, this is the reconstruction of the arc as devised by the art historian Konrad Rudolph, and whether this was the actual appearance of the image or the kind of images that were evocated in the mind of the readers of the mystic arc, I think that it doesn't matter at this point. But here, for instance, you can see this is the Jewish people which are in the ark, and at this point they are going out of the ark into Babylon. So by following the thread of these Jewish people, we are reflecting about the exile of the Jewish people in Babylon. Here, for instance, we have a different way of using this imagines agentes. This is other section of the ark, where we have the personification of different virtues, who are also traversing the ark. So we have to imagine this as a sort of virtual reality where all these images are in movement, and we also are in movement with them. Somehow, the fact that Hugh was able to compress all these readings into a single image was self-evident of the role of the arc and of the veracity of all these readings. So the image was a demonstrative image. Well, I will go a bit faster now. So what I would like to say is that somehow images were ingrained in our brain and are ingrained in our brain, as Nia Bolzoni both in her study of the role of images in medieval sermons, but also that images work in an analogic way, as suggested by Giorgio Agamben. And by analogic, I mean a method or a way of working which is neither inductive nor deductive. But it is based on the idea that something is like other thing. And for instance, here you can see this is an anatomic diagram used in Islamic times. This is not meant to be a representation of how the human body is, but how it works. So it is like a human body. And this use of images is a tradition that outlasts and endures after the end of the Middle Ages, well into the 17th century, but was left out due to the creation of new academic conventions where images were deemed second-class knowledge. And I would like to end with a reference to Raimon Llull. Raimon Llull was a mystic and polymath who was born in Majorca just after the Christian conquest in 1232. At the age of 30, he had a vision and he converted to Christianity. His life changed, and he devoted all the rest of his long life to the aim of converting people to Christian faith. And for that, he wrote more than 240 works. And here you can see him in this illustrated biography arranged by Thomas de Messier, his disciple, who is shown here discussing with the master. They are referring to this trunk with all the books by Raimon. And also, you can see here all those diagrams that allude to the deep meaning of the conversation they are having here. What Raimon attempted to do was something similar and at the same very different from what Hugh had done with his mystic art. He was trying to create a universal language able to be used for these preaching purposes, because he thought, well, if you're trying to convince a Muslim or a Jew about how wrong they are, we always be referring to our own text. So they will say, well, in my sacred text, this is explained in that way. And they will never be able to, we will never be able to find a common ground. And he decided then to create a sort of universal language, a logical language, which would be able for this kind of conversion purposes. That is what he called the ars. And the ars is, on the one hand, a technique, a method of reasoning. It is something visual, and it's creative. So it's not purely demonstrative. It's something that stimulates thought. But in many, as Hugh had done, he thought that by means of sensual images, one is able to acquire a deeper knowledge of the intelligible, the intellectual realities that explain God's reality. So I have tried to create my own dual diagram. So on the one hand you have reason, on the other hand you have faith and conversion. So the aim is to explain faith by means of reason at the, with the object of converting others, no matter their origin or the intellectual capacities, by means of the use of what he calls figura. And we can see here some examples. These are at the beginning of a manuscript he offered as a present to the Dukes of Venice. So, what kind of abstract language Llull created? It was based on the use of geometry, on the use of letters, which had different meanings associated, and a limited number of categories. So it was a dynamic method for thinking with images. So this sort of diagrams are the beginning of his works, and then the text offers a sort of commentary on the kind of questions that we can generate by using those diagrams. And I will try to explain how this works. So these are the basic categories Llull's thought is limited to. Because he thought that with these limited categories, every people coming from every creed can agree on, he will be able to demonstrate the existence of God and the principles of Christian faith. So you can see that on the one hand you have here, these are the attributes of God, these are relational concepts, these are the main questions you can ask, these are the different subjects you can think of, these are virtues and vices. And this is Llull's alphabet of thought. So he was trying to create a sort of artificial language. How these images work. So for instance, these are the divine attributes, which also work as the absolute principle. You can see here in this diagram, all these attributes correspond to a letter. And there are lines linking each of them. So these all constitute God's reality. And it is by the use of these lines and the other outer circle that this is turned into a sort of graph. So a figure where those concepts are linked. Expressing not only the connectivity of all those virtues among them, but also a sort of relational logic. this is other of the diagrams, and here the functioning is different. We have again those letters, but here we have these triangles, and these triangles are related to the different relational principles. So for instance, we have, this is in English, so you have beginning and middle, or difference, contradiction, complementarity, or equality, majority and minority. So we can again generate all sorts of combinations of this principle. So we will get something like this. So this is what in maths it's called an adjacent matrix. So he presents the results of combining all those letters using those diagrams. Because these charts gives us, or gives you, the possibility of creating all possible logical questions you can address about God and reality. And he even adds here a fourth image. I'm finishing now, sorry. So this is the fourth image, which is probably the most interesting one, because it will be the one having a longest history, a longest posterity. It is called inventiva, and I remind you about this understanding of creation as a finding. So this is a wheel for finding. And in this case, it is fixed, but in other manuscripts, all these circles can rotate. They are made by superposed paper circles. So this is a mechanical engine for generating more questions. Well, just a second, and if I was going to show you some of this ball bell, as he calls it, moving, but well, you can imagine that. This kind of combinational logic will have further development with Leibniz. But Leibniz will go farther than Llull. Llull was using letters, Leibniz will use numbers. And whereas Llull had limited himself to this sort of number of concepts, Leibniz will use an infinite, or at least theoretically infinite number of concepts. And we will lead this kind of mechanical way of reasoning much further. And his system will be logical, purely logical, not metaphysical. But he wouldn't have been able to develop his ideas without the precedent of Llull, and Llull's idea of this sort of performative thinking through the use of images. On the other side, we cannot understand Llull without this previous tradition of the antique and medieval memory, all this rhetoric tradition, the uses of loci memoria and imagines agentis. And this is my last slide, I promise. What I would like to show you today, or at least to stimulate discussion about, was about the way in which images condition our thought, and that somehow we are the images we carry with us, and that images can be a common ground to explore from the sciences and the humanities, because it was a very productive ground in the past. But we must think that images are always unpredictable, never neutral, never so easily disciplined, because they are, in the end, human. So, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the lecture. We have time for some questions. Yep, there's one.
I wonder, there's I was wondering, when you had the tree of life, that's a while back, but you were contrasting it to the tree of culture with the acting and joining and assimilating branches. And I wonder how much this image, how powerful it has been in preventing us from understanding that the tree of life actually looks more like the tree of culture. I mean, this is something that only since the genetics really took off and became cheap, has given us a question or a reason to question this tree of life, where we understand that viruses, they are transporting DNA between different organisms. 8% of human DNA are not human or viral. There may be non-human other parts in there. And all these kind of questions, plus that we know that several things have happened on this tree. Branchings have happened several times, the same branchings. And so my question basically is about the power of images. How much are images restricting, finding, inventing new memories in the sciences?
No, well, thank you for your reflection on that, because yeah, no, I absolutely agree. It depends on what image you are looking at, because there are images more productive than others. So yeah, from the side of the humanities, we have always been, well, at least in the last century and a half, working under the pressure that we were not scientific enough, and that we had to assimilate our methods to those of the sciences. And in the end, well, we can all gain from this sort of exchange. And yeah, I absolutely agree that sometimes those images, as for instance, this Porphyrian tree was a limiting image in the Middle Ages, because it was restricting philosophical thinking to this kind of binary categories, whereas Llull has to divide his own diagrams to be able to not only combine those binaries, but also to create even ternary combinations with this Volvel that has 3 concentric circles. So, no, absolutely. Images can be inhabilitating, but also the opposite. So thank you for also this second warning.
Did you say limiting? Limiting image? I'm sorry, is that a correct, is that an academic term in the art field, or was it just a general way of saying it?
No, well, it's a general way of saying it, so, yeah.
But they do?
Yeah, they do. As we were saying, they can be enabling and disabling at the same time.
More questions?
Thank you for a very interesting talk. So I'm interested in diagrams in mathematics, so in science, in case you take mathematics as part of science. But I'm wondering about your terminology, because you use different phrases or terms to refer to these things that you're talking about, images, diagrams, and you use graphic, visual, display, and do you distinguish between these, and if so, how? I see that there seems to be some kind of systematic use when you refer to the various things as images and as diagrams, but I wonder if you have any
Well,
thoughts about it.
I could have tried to be more systematic and more precise. For me, image is just a more general word. I reserve the use of diagrams for these very specific types of images where you have this sort of geometrical order as governing principles. But as I said, some of these geometrical images have a sort of figurative antecedent or some sort of sub-image that is also at the back. And sometimes this creates some sort of tension between what it is more abstract, more geometric, and what it is more figurative and more irregular, so to speak. So in that sense, it's not that easy to, for instance, when you think about the stemma, to say, is this geometric or it is figurative? And I guess that that's also part of my argument, that it's not that simple.
Because you have this one, which on the right, which mainly consists of words, text, but placed in different ways. So, in a way, I don't know if that is an image or whether it's a diagram.
Well, it's a diagram, but somehow it evocates this notion of branch, which is
Because you have the lines, so that is given indicating relations.
So somehow there is a sort of degree of figurativeness. So this could be some sort of degree 0 or almost 0, and then if you think about those trees I showed by Joachim de Fiore, you have the highest figurative degree.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes, sorry. I thought it's present there as well. I detected a shift, not in your argument, but in the nature of the diagrams that you were presenting. The early ones, stemma and tree and rhizome, they all involve connections between points in a field. And then we had the Noah's Ark, and that was very much an enclosed space. Looked a bit like Central Park, I thought.
Yeah, well,
But
I wish I...
and it was divided into spaces.
I
and
know,
that was
I
part
can
of
see the central part, yeah.
And that's the way that memory works, and memory is a storage space where you keep things. But then within that, within those areas, there were lines, and those weren't just lines where things were stationed. There were Jewish people who were moving out somewhere, and there were other things moving through the landscape. It's as if it's an area of boxes with railways going through.
Yeah,
it's
well,
very mixed.
maybe not only, well, that of course, but not only that, and now I can explain this a bit better. So this is the ark, which is placed in a sort of mappa mundi, and here you have the 4 winds and also the 4 ages, sorry. And this is the circle of universe, and you have the zodiac. So it's a sort of Chinese box with spaces inside other spaces. But this is not a static space. That's what I meant. So you can traverse it, and there are figures that are moving from one place to the other, and they are following, as you said, that sort of railways. So there are connections here too, not only these main connections here or these, because, well, this is really complex. Here you have the sort of chronology that I showed in the first image. So Adam is here, and this is also descending chronologically. And here you have paradise, and here you have the Last Judgment. So it's a space which is moving and even evolving.
Through which you can travel.
Yeah.
A brief question relating to, shall we say, wars about images. I'm not speaking about cartoon wars or, repressing images in this terms of social norms, but more like, for example, the tree of life you have. In biology, there's a war known as the cladist war, and that's whether the tree of life should be represented as a evolutionary tree or phylogenetic tree or cladist tree. And as I understand it, was a bitter war. And that war about representation of the tree of life, you can also relate that to the tree of culture, which some have said, well, it actually includes oblique transmission. That is, you can be a mother to your uncles as well as to your son, which you don't have in the life. But the question is about these wars, or what is the right representation for the purpose, and more generally, you know, the evolution of these images. Do you have any comments on that, or is something you've looked into? Why this? Was there, you know, did they dispute it? Did they disregard it, and so on and so forth?
Well, I feel sometimes trapped into words, in the sense that, and that's why I started with Benjamin, that I cannot find the right terminology or the way of expressing what images can do. So that's why, again, my terminology sometimes was vague, because it's very difficult to express this sort of flux of images and the way they work, and they let us remind, well, the way in which they remind us of other things at the same time. So I don't know if I'm asking.
If I can add something, I suppose I'm basically asking a simple question relating to the function they serve. Will allow them to be used more or less? A question like that. So, in the sense of what you say, you can do more with these images, they become popular, and so on and so forth. The connection to the function they serve for society, so to say.
Yeah, well, sometimes they lose touch with their original meanings, and they evolve in ways that were not anticipated. But again, my concern is that we are never able to fully discipline images. We cannot make them do what we want to do, and just that.
Fair enough. I mean, the theory of everything here, the physicists, as I understand, are still looking. So, anyway, thanks a lot, Rosa.